All right. So thanks, Mark, of course, for that introduction. And of course, welcome and thank you to so many of you. It's great to see so many friendly faces and names in my Zoom here today, as I'm here to talk about my dissertation, which, as Mark mentioned, is called Letters of Map Change on Flood Insurance Rate Maps in the United States National Flood Insurance Program. So in this presentation, I'm going to tell you a bit of the story about how letters of map change and flood hazard maps in the United States are a product of material, technical, regulatory, and human factors, as well as describe implications from my findings that letters of map change occur more often than not in wealthier and whiter communities. So for about the first 10 minutes, I'm going to walk you through are you seeing my slides? Sorry, is that up?
Not yet.
No slides.
Sorry, I can get a full start where the screen share is not. Can you see them now?
Yep, you're good.
Sorry. Okay. Well, so as I was mentioning, my title slide here. So again, for about the first 10 minutes or so, I'm going to guide you through really a summary of the key concepts from chapters 1 and 2 of my dissertation, the titles of which are highlighted in black on this slide. This introduction will set up my presentation of some of my results from chapters 4 and 5 of my dissertation, after which I will conclude. So to begin, let's start familiarizing you with some of the phrases that appear in my title slide. The National Flood Insurance Program, which we'll see abbreviated as NFIP, was authorized in 1968 by the United States Congress. The policies backed by NFIP are meant to be actuarially based, so that is to say that the level of flood hazard a building has determines the cost of an insurance premium to be paid. And that is where the flood insurance rate maps, or abbreviated as FIRMs, come into play. FIRMs are created for individual US counties and depict various zones of greater or lesser flood hazard that determine insurance premiums. Letters of map change are alterations made to flood zones on FIRMs that increase or decrease the flood hazard for one or multiple buildings. So that's, of course, the simple explanation, but I'm going to spend some more time explaining what's all going on here. So the NFIP is operated by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, in the United States. And FEMA uses part of their yearly budget from the United States Congress to hire technical experts who do the work of creating new FIRMs to keep flood hazard predictions up to date. And the various flood zones depicted on a FIRM are determined by the level of hazard, the type of flooding, and the accuracy and precision of the underlying data. So through this talk, when I say flood zones, I will be specifically referring to a set of hazard zones on FIRMs that are aggregated into what is called the Special Flood Hazard Area, or SFHA. Special flood hazard areas are places with 1% or greater chance of inundation per calendar year based on probability interpretations of the historical hydrologic record. So basically, that where flooding is predicted to most likely occur. So to help you understand that visually, this map of Southeast Florida and the Miami metropolitan area shows many of the possible flood zone types that are aggregated into special flood hazard areas. So we see various A-type zones on this map, like A or AE, which are from inland flooding sources, so rivers or overland ponding, as well as V-type zones along the coast, which are from wave action and storm surge from the ocean. But this map is also showing us where zones based on lower or higher data quality are distributed. So for example, the A type of zones on here are less precise and only have approximated elevations versus the AE or VE type of zones where that E is meaning that it has floodwater elevations that have been measured. So for any firm presently being used for the basis of insurance premiums, a group I call propertied interests are the initiators of these letters of map change. And propertied interests, this term can include people like elected community representatives or property developers, But for the specific types of letters of map change I'm going to talk about in this talk, they are specifically initiated by property owners and renters. So while I investigate a variety of types of letters of map change in my dissertation, in this presentation, I'm just going to focus on a couple specific types that are called letters of map amendment, which you will see abbreviated as LOMAs, and as well as letters of map revision based on fill, or LOMAR Fs. So you can think of LOMAs and LOMAR Fs as exemptions to a building being included in that special flood hazard area. So for both types, this exemption is going to be based on the relationship between two elevations. The lowest elevation of a building compared to what is called the base flood elevation, or BFE. So the base flood elevation is the elevation to which it is predicted floodwaters will reach if they inundate the special flood hazard area. So LOMAs and LOMAR Fs occur when a building's lowest elevation is initially determined to be below the BFE, thus placing it again within the special flood hazard area, but later the building elevation is actually determined to be above the BFE, thus granting it that exemption. So LOMAs occur because of what are called inadvertent inclusions, which can be visualized in the figure shown on this slide. So the building on the left has been correctly mapped into the special flood hazard area, as it is flooded when waters rise to the BFE. But in contrast, the building on the right could obtain a LOMA because even if it's been inadvertently included in the special flood hazard area, it should not get flooded when waters rise to the BFE. So inadvertent inclusions occur because the elevation data sets used to create firms have to cover these whole counties. They're most often derived from photogrammetry or LiDAR, which can have uncertainties of tens of centimeters up to meters. But because building elevations for the BFEs are measured to the 10th of a foot, or about 3 centimeters, FEMA allows more precise measurements of building elevations using land surveys. So basically, if a property resident can obtain a LOMA if a hired land surveyor finds the lowest elevation is actually above that BFE. A letter of map revision based on fill can be obtained when both an engineer and a land surveyor conclude that a building has been safely elevated above the BFE using fill dirt or pylons. And so in these images here, again, on the left, we have a building flooded before being elevated, and on the right, not flooding after being, again, elevated above the BFE. So if you own a home in the special flood hazard area, why pursue a LOMA or LOMAR F? Well, the primary answer is because for the same coverage of damages, you will pay lower insurance premiums. So as the figure on this slide shows, a building below or at the BFE, shown by the left and center buildings, will pay up to thousands of dollars more per year than the building on the right that is above the BFE. However, hiring a land surveyor for these processes can cost hundreds of dollars easily, and LOMAR Fs usually run easily into the thousands of dollars due to the cost of elevating a building. So these costs prompt the question if people with less means or disposable income are able to seek and obtain these exemptions from LOMAs at the same rate as people with greater means or wealth. And this question is important because literature on biophysical flood hazard is amassing evidence predicting increases in future flood hazard across much of the United States due to the climate emergency. I mean, we're seeing this in the news, if you go look at British Columbia, just to the north, right, of the US, but across the US as well. So because firms can only be based on historical data, they may be underestimating flood hazard in many places, meaning that the BFE is actually at a higher elevation, or should be at a higher elevation, and that a large flood actually will inundate those properties that are presently obtaining LOMAs or LOMAR Fs. So if people with greater wealth are obtaining exemptions more often, than those with less able means, over time, this is actually going to exacerbate or increase wealth inequality because those with more wealth will actually be paying lower insurance premiums, basically for the same payout for any sort of damages. So with all of that background, I'm now going to shift into my attempt to answering a couple of these research questions that you see here on the slide. So basically, where do we have more or fewer buildings that are being changed from inside to outside of the special flood hazard area, and who's benefiting or not benefiting from those changes? So these questions are part of my investigation of chapters 4 and 5 in my dissertation, the titles of which, again, I have now highlighted here in black. I'm not going to be presenting any results from chapter 3 today, so if you want to know more about that, please ask in the Q&A. So, presenting some work from chapter 4, I had two main goals here. The first was to map where LOMAs and LOMAR-Fs occurred across the contiguous United States between the years of 2013 and 2018, as well as comparing these observations with socio-demographic variables at the census tract scale. The second was to develop a conceptual model that incorporated how both physical and human geography factors together help determine where greater or lesser exemptions would be predicted to occur. Particularly when we start with a, say, less accurate or precise elevation, but before measuring a more precise one, just like we have with LOMAs or LOMAR-Fs. So my conceptual model hypothesis, there are three factors that determine the number of LOMAs or LOMAR-Fs that can occur per a defined aerial unit, like a census tract. The first factor, which sets the maximum possible number of exemptions, is the number of buildings in the special flood hazard area. The second factor determines the maximum number of LOMA exemptions that could occur, and is what I call false positive potential. So false positive potential refers to the buildings that, if their elevation was measured by that more precise land surveying, would be shown to actually be above the BFE and are possible to obtain a LOMA. All the buildings basically that are still below the BFE are still in the special flood hazard area after that measurement would only be able to seek a LOMAR-F. The third factor then is the economic and demographic characteristics of places, with the hypothesis that the observed number of LOMAs and LOMAR-Fs will be closer to a maximum potential where indicators of wealth are higher. Now, assessing false positive potential, unfortunately, here isn't actually really feasible because there isn't a way to reasonably obtain land survey grade elevation data for each building in the special flood hazard area across the US. I mean, if there was, I would be out of a job doing this study. So instead, as a proxy, here I use those special flood hazard area flood zones I talked about earlier, where my hypothesis is that the percent of LOMAs that will be higher than the percentage of buildings in like A type of zones, for example, that use more approximate elevations, while percent of LOMAs will be lower than the percent buildings in those higher accuracy and precision zones like AE or VE type of zones. And I hypothesize the inverse for LOMAR-Fs. So to say that I would expect proportionally more LOMAR-Fs than buildings in, proportionally wise, in zones where higher accuracy and precision elevation there are higher precision accurate elevation measurements, excuse me. So I included LOMAs and LOMAR-Fs in my analysis if they were submitted between the beginning of 2013 to the end of 2018, and if they were located in a county that had a firm issued before the beginning of 2013. So there were 1,920 counties that could be subdivided into about 44,000 census tracts within the contiguous US that met those criteria. The study counties in gray here are those ones that met that criteria. So I used 4 data sources for my analysis, which I'm just going to quickly try and show you visually. So the first were the LOMAs and LOMAR-Fs, which we see here as black points, with the Oregon counties that had firms included in this study in white. So to help you visualize my other data layers, I'm actually going to help now zoom in on part of Lane County in the Eugene-Springfield area. And when we do so, the blue color you're now seeing is the special flood hazard area. So in this case, mainly from the Willamette River and its tributaries. All the light gray we are seeing are individual building footprints. So we kind of see that big mass of them that are all in the middle. So that's the Eugene-Springfield area. And again, if we zoom in now, once again, even further on this time part of Eugene, on Eugene, we see now we can again see the buildings a little clearer. Special flood hazard area, also again those LOMA and LOMA F points. The purple lines here are just kind of major roads and highways that I put in for context. And the fourth analysis layer that I used are those medium gray lines you can see as well, which are the census tract layers. And those have accompanying American Community Survey data that had the socioeconomic estimates behind them. So by overlaying those four layers together, I calculated the number of buildings intersecting the special flood hazard area and the number of LOMAs and LOMA Fs per flood zone type for each census tract, as well as that relationship of LOMAs and LOMA F occurrence with socioeconomic variables. I used a probabilistic approach with Wilcoxon rank sum tests to determine if there was a statistically significant difference in the distributions between those American Community Survey variables for census tracts that had LOMAs or LOMA Fs versus census tracts that did not contain those types of designations. If you have more questions about the methodological details, please ask in the Q&A. You can see that the American Community Survey variables, all of them that I tested are listed in the table at the bottom of this slide, although only the bolded ones are some that I'm going to discuss in my results. So given my limited time, I'm just going to show you a couple of results from this chapter. On this slide, we are looking at the number and percentage of LOMAs, LOMA Fs, and buildings in the special flood hazard area for all census tracts when subdivided by flood zone type. So I'm first going to just highlight the LOMA results here. And we can see for the LOMAs that there is a proportionately higher representation in the A flood zone when compared to the percentage of buildings. So that's shown by the black boxes. But in contrast, flood zones with higher accuracy and precision, so like AE, AH, VE, they all had proportionally lower percentages of LOMAs than percent buildings, which is shown by the red boxes, or I assume if you are colorblind, those are more grayish. Switching to look at the LOMA Fs, we see proportionally higher LOMA Fs in the AE zone. So again, that's the black boxes, but the percentage is higher than percentage buildings is higher than percentage LOMA Fs in the other flood zones, again shown in red. So these findings for the A and AE zones follow the hypotheses I stated earlier, while some of the flood zones like AH, AO, or VE had lower percent LOMAs or LOMA Fs than buildings for both cases. LOMA Fs had a higher percentage than LOMAs for these types of flood zones. So now I've selected out some of the Wilcoxon rank sum test results. Again, I know there's a lot going on even on this table, which isn't everything, but I'm just going to highlight a few things again. So first, for the census tracts where LOMAs or LOMA Fs occurred, the number of households is statistically significantly higher than tracts without LOMAs or LOMA Fs. Similarly, median income and per capita income have statistically significant higher average values, shown by the black boxes here, and percent poverty has a lower average value, shown by the red, where LOMAs and LOMA Fs occurred, again compared to census tracts where they did not occur. And there were also a couple interesting differences between LOMAs and LOMA Fs. Percentage non-white population for LOMAs, which is highlighted in the red boxes, that had the second highest z-score of variables tested, indicating census tracts with higher percentage white populations were much more likely to obtain LOMAs than not. In contrast, percent of white population was actually not a significant variable for LOMA Fs. Looking at median home value, those are the black boxes, that was significant for both, but places with LOMAs had higher median home values than places without LOMAs, while places with LOMA Fs had lower median home values than places without LOMA Fs. So again, in the interest of time, I'm just going to move on now to chapter 5 and its results. So in chapter 4, in order to examine that data across the US, I had to rely on comparing LOMAs and LOMA Fs that occurred for individual properties to those aggregated census tract estimates. And now my goal in chapter 5 then was to examine relationships of those LOMAs and LOMA Fs with property scale characteristics like land use, property values, in order to match up those scales. So because Florida is one of the few states in the US where property scale data is standardized and made available by yearly assessment for every county within the state, as well as just because that's where the most LOMAs and LOMAR-Fs occurred in any state in the US, I examined the relationship of LOMAs and LOMAR-Fs that occurred, again, between 2013 to 2018 with property characteristics from Florida study counties, again, that had firms before 2013. So the data types here were the same from chapter 4. The only difference was I swapped out the census tracts for tax lots or individual property layer. And my initial data exploration found that over 3/4 of all LOMAs and LOMAR-Fs in Florida were for single family homes. So I focused further examination on those. And more specifically, for any county with more than 30 LOMAs or LOMAR-Fs, I used Wilcoxon rank sum tests again to assess differences in the distributions of property values for properties with LOMAs or LOMAR-Fs versus other properties that did not have those designations but that were still in the special flood hazard area. However, knowing property values would also be influenced by its location. So for example, being on the coast versus inland, for every LOMA and LOMAR-F, I also determined the percentile of the assessed property value by comparing the property value against all other properties in the same county that were also in the same flood zone type. And those percentiles were then aggregated for examination, which I will show you. So first, I just want to briefly show you a few maps here. What you're seeing on the top left is showing the total number of single family homes located within the special flood hazard area per Florida county. The bottom left map is showing the number of single family homes that obtained LOMAs per county. And the bottom right is the number of single family homes that obtained LOMAR-Fs per county. And so the main thing I just wanted to show here was that generally what we're seeing is that the number of occurrences of LOMAs and LOMAR-Fs more or less tracks to some degree with the number of buildings that are in the special flood hazard area. So generally more LOMAs and more LOMAR-Fs to some effect where there are more total homes in the special flood hazard area. So on this slide, I'm going to summarize some of the results from the Wilcoxon rank sum tests rather than trying to throw big tables at you and have you digest them all. So there were 25 counties that had 30 or more LOMAs in them, and 19 of those had statistically significant differences in their distributions for assessed home value. Now, specifically, 7 of those counties, in some of those counties, homes with LOMAs had higher average values than other homes in the special flood hazard area, while in 12 of the counties, homes that had LOMAs had lower average values than other homes that were in the special flood hazard area. And there was a similar kind of split for LOMAR-Fs. We had 13 counties that had 30 or more of those, 9 of which had statistical significance. Of those 9, 7 had homes where the average value was higher for LOMAR-Fs than homes that otherwise were in the special flood hazard area, meaning the other remaining 2 had lower average home values for LOMAR-Fs than other types of homes, just other homes that were in the special flood hazard area. So when we actually look at this further, the ranked average home value for properties in the special flood hazard area was found to be a good indicator whether the LOMAs or LOMAR-Fs average values were significantly higher or lower. So for both LOMAs and LOMAR-Fs, when special flood hazard area average home values were ranked by county, almost all the counties with the lowest end of special flood hazard area home average values had higher statistically significant LOMA or LOMAR-F values. And in contrast, many of the counties that were very expensive, had the highest special flood hazard area assessed home values, consistently had statistically significantly lower average LOMA or LOMAR-F values. So now those Wilcoxon rank sum tests are interesting, but again, remember they aggregated all the flood zone types together, meaning that again, we were comparing high value coastal homes that might be worth millions of dollars with homes inland that are worth some tiny fraction of that price. So I further examined property value percentile distributions for LOMAs and LOMAR-Fs when subdivided by A, AE, and AH flood zone types, which made up about 95% of all properties in those of all flood zone types. And this slide shows histograms of the LOMA distributions by the 3 flood zones, and the results actually end up being kind of mixed. So when I highlight the median value of each percentile distribution, we see that the median values for the A, AE, and AH flood zones are respectively 59.1, 45, and 50.6. So meaning that homes that obtained LOMAs in the A flood zone often were higher value than many of the others in the special flood hazard area, while homes that obtained LOMAs in AE zones were actually usually lower value, at least more than half of them were, than the median special flood hazard area value. For AH, actually they were pretty well matched otherwise to values that were in the special flood hazard area. So then in contrast to LOMAs, we can see the median property values for homes that obtained LOMA Fs were 78.3, 58.5, and 77 for these zones. So basically, they were all well above, the majority of homes obtaining LOMA Fs were relatively higher value than others in the special flood hazard area. And the last thing I just want to show is that when you put all these histograms together, I'm just highlighting here that in 5 of the 6 distributions, so the exception being LOMAs for AE flood zone, the lowest number of occurrences was in that 0 to 10 percentile. So having gone through now those findings, I'm going to move towards my conclusion by discussing how a few literatures I believe that my dissertation results can be put into conversation with. So the first literature I see my dissertation contributing to is lay expert modes of scientific knowledge production. So basically where we're studying various formations of how technical experts and lay people, or people not basically recognized as experts, can interact in the production of scientific knowledge. And specifically, I see my findings contributing to some past literature that has been written about what is called the public debate model. So this is a conceptual model that helps us understand these interactions. And basically in the public debate model, we have experts producing scientific knowledge, but lay people being able to voice understandings or concerns about this knowledge, which in turn can influence then how that knowledge is reproduced or understood by those experts. And this is basically how LOMAs and LOMA Fs occur. Property residents initiate them, but the work is actually done by engineers or land surveyors. And I think where my contribution comes in is to ideas about this model is that in my readings about there's really always been this conceptualization that as lay people are undifferentiated in their ability to access potentially changing this knowledge. Where in contrast, I think my findings support the idea that especially when this knowledge production is mediated via other experts who, in this case are charging for services or, has to have some sort of monetary exchange, there's going to be that more and more that unequal knowledge production skewed toward more wealthy people or groups. Another place I see this dissertation contributing to is critical physical geography. If you're not familiar, the 3 tenets of it, kind of as has been posited, are shown on this slide. I'm actually not going to discuss those any further. Instead, I think understanding my contribution in the literature can be best understood by me reading a quote from a paper written by Stuart Lane in 2014, where he said, quote, "Hydrological knowledge cannot be understood if it is divorced from the networks within which it is produced. That is, an assemblage of elements that are material, technical, regulatory, and human," end quote. Basically, in that paper, Lane was calling for more research that produces hydrologic knowledge that encompasses all 4 of these aspects, because in our case, all 4 of them really matter in a program like NFIP. But there actually hasn't been a lot of work kind of on the follow-up end of that and done in that kind of vein. So I see my dissertation really being part of a growing body of knowledge on hydrologic knowledge, flood hazard, that has tried to implement all these things together. And the third literature is critical environmental justice. I don't see my work actually contributing so much here as rather I would say drawing upon its ideas and bringing them to research on flood hazard and risk. Critical environmental justice scholarship argues that rather than ameliorating environmental injustices, the state, or in our case, the federal government, is actually a primary contributor to environmental injustices via public policies and social structures that make political economic amenities preferentially accessible to the already powerful. So now, I don't think that NFIP and letters of map change were designed to intentionally exacerbate wealth or racial inequality by making LOMAs or LOMA-Fs preferentially accessible to more wealthy individuals or communities. Nor are those, rather, what I would argue here is that we need to understand the inequalities that I observed based on the broader histories of housing in the US, so based on things like redlining, forced removal of populations due to build interstate highway systems, as well as how the idea of NFIP itself was grounded in the assumption of single-family home ownership, which itself is a post-World War II idea that almost exclusively built homes and wealth for white Americans. So I would argue that only by studying those legacies of housing together with these flood maps can we understand these things that I'm observing. So to conclude, I selected out a segment of my dissertation today to tell you the story of how across the contiguous United States, where letters of map change occur is partly a story of physical geography and the underlying data quality of maps. But another part of the story was the letter of map change occurs more often than not in wealthier and whiter communities. So focusing on individual homes in Florida, I also found that LOMAs were accessed by a variety of homeowners, again, where I was using home value as a proxy, compared to LOMA-Fs, although both were less accessible or utilized by the lowest value homes. And more broadly, my research showed how studying these material, technical, regulatory, and human aspects that influence knowledge about flood hazard production can help us understand how unequal knowledge production can be skewed towards more wealthy populations or groups, and how that could be leading to increasing inequalities and ongoing and future flood recovery. So I just want to say thanks, everyone, for listening. I have a lot of thank yous. I just want to quickly make before I hand it back over to the committee. First, thank you to the Department of Geography, all faculty for partly awarding me a Sandra Pritchard Fellowship a few years ago as well. That went to hiring some of the undergraduate students you see listed here. So Katie, Wenhow, Mason, also worked with Justin, Dane and Chris as part of class that Carolyn Fish taught last fall on some of this related work. I owe a really big thank you. I saw she was here today, Sarah Prowley at Syracuse. Thank you, Sarah, so much. I emailed Sarah basically out of the blue in 2018 and just trying to start up a conversation, and we ended up working together, which became chapter 3 in a published paper now that is chapter 3 of this dissertation. She was very generous to share some funds with me that actually helped acquire some of the data that went into this research. So again, Sarah, thank you for being so great to work with. Thank you, of course, to my committee, who, my thanks is probably will never be enough for how many times they went through and saw this project change over time. So thanks, Mark, Pat, Lee, and Rebecca for all the work you've put in on this project. So many, definitely not enough time to thank all the past and present GeoGrads, that make the geogeography community the thriving community it is. I just want to say a couple of special thank yous to Jewel, Danielle Perry, Aaron Zettlerman, and Dongmei Chen, and also pretty much past members of River Group and Cecil Lab for providing some particularly special inspiration through my time here. I also met so many wonderful people, outside of the department in Eugene generally, who I think really were an amazing support network and amazing friends. So Shao, Maxine, Sophia, Mallory, Reese, Joanne, I know many of you are here today. I owe you more than my ending friendship, really. Thank you so much. And also a shout out to other GTFF members who a lot of you who are here, don't have time to list you all, but thank you for being here and supporting me. I've had so many family members who have been supportive of my higher education, but I'm sure will forever be indebted to my mother and father, so Deborah Bradford, Ikely, who have always been supportive of me in whatever next step I've been taking in my educational journey, And along this journey of doing this work and writing this dissertation, I met and just a few months ago married my partner, Kylan Gartland. My thanks is probably never going to be enough for all of her support during the periods I never thought this dissertation would be done. Thank you, everyone. Once again, that's all the time I have. Thank you for listening, and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Devin. Thank you, Devin. Devin, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm getting a strange echo. Thanks very much, Devin. At this point, the process is that the dissertation committee will get a chance to do a couple of rounds of questions. And traditionally, this begins with the institutional representative. So Rebecca, if you would like, you may begin.
Sure, thank you. So I'll focus my questions on some things that you addressed in the dissertation, but I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit more about, and on brand with my discipline, it's about policy implications and recommendations. So my sort of two related questions are, what would you tell to FEMA from your research? What would you tell them to change in the program? And then the second one is, what would you tell to local planners about land use regulations around floodplains based on your research?
Sure. So for your first question, there's an easy answer and there's a more difficult question in my or answer in my opinion actually to that, because I think the easy answer within FEMA's capabilities would be to say, try and within say the FEMA structure, maybe produce more grants or something, create some sort of incentive to target those populations who probably are being underserved, right? But there's also a lot of literature out there that suggests like that only goes so far. It still doesn't catch everyone, and there's still limitations to that. So I could see other recommendations outside of that as well, but I won't. To keep to your question, I'll then go on to the second part, because I think at this present moment, what I would tell a local, person on the ground, in terms of land use, I do think one thing I couldn't look at with this study, but I would be interested to see is how this plays out in places that take actually extra precautions. So there are places that, instead of being right at that BFE, they say, no, like it has to be at least another foot above, or we're not going to allow it. And so, particularly, are those places seeing a lot less damages? We would suppose they should, but I don't have a lot of data to back that up. But I would say, in that kind of scenario, basically incentivizing them to try and just put in those kind of regulations. I know actually right now until mid-December, FEMA is talking about totally taking in comments and overhauling, the federal level minimum standards they have, which haven't been updated basically since very early in the program. So I'd also tell them, hey, if it's for literally right now, go also do that. But yes, there's more of the, I think, on the ground things you can do as well. So I don't know if that answered everything you would like, but that's a quick version.
Thank you.
Rebecca, do you have others, or shall we move on?
I have some others, but I'll cede my time to the rest of the committee first, and we can come back if there's time.
Okay. Lee, would you like to ask?
Sure, thank you. Devin, I first want to congratulate you on really a huge piece of work, very impressive. And also, I've never been at a dissertation defense before that had 52 Zoom participants. So I think that speaks to your the huge presence and contribution that you've made to our department. So I really want to acknowledge that and thank you. It's been really a pleasure to work with you. So I have two related questions. One is, there is this argument that's often advanced by conservative think tanks and like the Heartland Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, that INFIP is an unfair cross subsidy and that it's a beach house bailout. And I wanted to ask what your work has to say about that.
I think, you know, at least the results that I showed today would largely refute that claim because, you know, if I actually went back to some of the slides, like besides, you know, I showed that slide near the end where it was, you know, almost in every case by flood zone, you know, we saw the least used was, you know, that 0 to 10 percentile, basically on the very low end of property values, which I assumed was kind of proxy for people at the low end of you know, income or ability to change. But almost every second lowest case, if you actually go back and look at those, is about 90 to 100 percentile, which is, you know, telling me that those properties are also largely not using this for probably a variety of reasons, whether that's it doesn't cover a large amount. You know, NFIP can only cover up to, what is it, $500,000 in damages between the structure and the contents. So, but you know, maybe I'm getting off into the weeds there. Where I think I would say, you know, my work, you know, largely show that the people who are benefiting are more in the middle than, I wouldn't say any sort of bailouts for largely, at least I will recognize the limitation that I was only focused on single family homes. Now, if I looked at other property types in Florida, that might tell me a slightly different story. And I don't want to take Florida as a be all end all for more broadly in the US. But so I will say with those caveats, my results do not support that claim. But again, with those limitations.
Okay. Thank you. So then my second related question is, you mentioned a few times in the dissertation, also drawing on Rebecca Elliott's work, that the inclusion of structures in the flood hazard area is connected to broader moral decisions around insurance and safety nets. And I wanted to hear you talk about something that doesn't really come up in the dissertation, and that's the idea of solidarity and membership in the risk pool, because I want to hear you talk through what a letter of map revision based on fill or a letter of map amendment means for solidarity and future solidarity.
Sure. So I would say that I think part of what I was trying to say when, you know, looking at these LOMAs or LOMA Fs was, you know, if it's true that all of our, you know, much of this scientific literature, say outside of NFIP, is pointing to all these indications like flood risk is increasing and should actually be higher than these maps are showing. If a property is getting a LOMA or LOMA F and they're barely above that BFE, you know, they're probably also likely to flood very soon in the near future again, you know, when the next big flood occurs, because we're only looking at historical data. And so that's not right. That's not solidarity anymore. Then they're getting out and they're paying way less into the pool for really actually carrying the same level of risk still. And you know, I think that has largely been ignored because I keep seeing these conversations about, oh well, you know, NFIP's all this amount in debt, and there's a whole variety of reasons there, but I do wonder how much this piece of it is contributing when you have, you know, tens of thousands of these occurring, you know, especially if you look even just over the past several years across the US, you know, and that's kind of, I think in that kind of sense, eroding a little of that like solidarity that Rebecca Elliott talks about, you know, where people who are able can get out of that. I don't know. In terms of future, I think it's also going to be interesting. Obviously, I didn't talk about it all in this talk, but how, you know, Rebecca has also already written a little bit, or like has tried to think through how the new risk rating 2.0 system that's starting to kind of come through might change things too. And you know, she said how she said something like, oh, well, you know, we're going to see more individualization of risk, and that's actually going to be potentially a detriment to further the solidarity of, you know, everybody being just in the same type of flood zone, which I can buy, but I also wonder how much if that is true, because the firms still are going to be used as the basis for a lot of regulation, and people are still going to be in high hazard flood zone. They're still going to be exposed to that, you know, that hazard, and so I think they're still going to seek to deal with that, whether, you know, in the variety of ways, whether it's the LOMA, whether it's the LOMA or F, you know, or other means. But I do think, I don't know, for the future, like that is something to, I don't know, I guess that's all I have to say on that, but yeah.
Okay, thank you. I'll hand it over.
Great. Pat?
Okay, first of all, Devin, thanks for a really good presentation. And I'd also like to call out the amazing job you did on data assembly, on data acquisition and assembly, getting information from FEMA, but having to extract data very tediously from PDF sources and things like that. You've
Yes.
built a really amazing database that this dissertation is based on, and that was kind of a, you know, a hidden bonus that the audience probably didn't hear in your presentation.
Yes, the many months that
And-
I spent assembling that.
Yeah, and I also think it's a database that there are probably a lot of other products that can come from. So you've done something really special in that regard. I guess I have, given the fact that I just complimented you on the data you have, I have some questions about data you didn't use.
Sure.
And I guess maybe I'll just throw out one at this point, which is, to me, one of the interesting things about the flood insurance program is the importance of the role of counties and maybe even in some cases, city government. So it's a federal program. The states, as far as I can tell, don't have a very big role in it. It's implemented more or less at the county level. So when the property owner is interacting with the government, a lot of their interaction, a lot of their information flow comes from the county. FEMA is ultimately the decision maker, but the county is a very important intermediary. And I appreciate the way you're able to extract a lot of socioeconomic indicators to examine the pattern of behavior within this program. But I wonder about other factors that aren't in those socioeconomic data sets, like how active is the county? How inclusive is the county? Is county government accessible to local property owners, or is it differentially accessible? How much information does the county provide to property owners? So to me, there's a whole set of factors that might be influencing this process that are covered in things like that, perhaps other areas. Can you think about ways to get at that, given what you've learned from this, given you had a really nice kind of meaty data analysis product, quantitative data analysis product, if you wanted to get beyond those factors, how would you go about it? What would you look at and what methods would you use?
That's a good question. Because I definitely have thought about this, that, you know, you mentioned, you know, for example, the whole, yeah, what if some counties are being much more proactive in informing their constituents, or, you know, versus not, you know, how much impact would that have? And I really struggled to figure out, like, yeah, how would you even go about, you know, tackling that? I think the first thing I would do, if I was going to approach this more from a quantitative data side, would actually be go to look at the, what is it called? The community, the CRS, I'm forgetting the acronym's name off the top of my head, the community, not resources service. But there's a program that FEMA has that basically incentivizes communities to go above the minimum standards. Community rating system. Thank you, Sarah. That's where my brain is at. Yeah, so there's quantitative data that I think you can obtain that would allow you to see per community what communities are doing beyond, or at least there's some rankings. They have like this ranking system, and the higher rank you have, the more insurance premiums get reduced for people paying. And that's based on a variety of things. It's anything from like, is the city or county communicating the flood risk to the people, which gains you a little bit of points, but not a lot? Or are they taking, do they have a higher freeboard where they're requiring that you have to be another foot or two above the BFE before you're actually officially out of it, or considered at a lower hazard flood zone than the special flood hazard area, or and that would be gain you more points because that theoretically should actually protect you rather than just informing you of your hazard. So I think I would go to that data and try and look at places that say are showing, hey, yes, we're doing this communication, or no, we're not, to kind of and compare them side by side, and again try and find relative apples to apples to say, okay, these places theoretically in many other ways should be about the same, but is this factor seeming to have a difference? I think that's where I would start. Potentially besides going to communities themselves and talking to people or something. But
yeah, that was one aspect I hope you would talk about, and that is, is there a complementary survey approach, and not survey, more interview approach to talk to people in local contexts, and extract that kind of rich experience that isn't necessarily very well captured.
Yeah, I mean, I want to be in the driver's seat here, but this is something that Sarah Prowley and I, obviously we wrote the one chapter together, I have talked about doing something, like this further from the work that we did. And so that was, this course has not been done yet, but it is an idea that we had, I would say. So yeah, I think it's something that we want to do, and to be hopefully whatever our next steps are, we will have the ability and time to do it.
Okay, thank you. Mark, I yield my remaining time if I have any.
Okay, Devin, given our time, I'm just going to ask one question, and it's going to be slightly different from what the others have asked, because it's going to be based on technology. The things that you presented on today were those amendments that are directly related to measurement of topography. And there, as you mentioned, there's different ways to do this. As you probably know, over the past decade or a little bit more, the United States has by state, has had a whole set of programs to increase LIDAR coverage. And one of the primary reasons for funding those efforts has been to better map the topography of floodplains. Starting with North Carolina, and of course, Oregon has had it, and others. And I'm wondering, first of all, do you think that those efforts have actually reduced disparities or inequalities because of making the known BFEs more precise, but they still have some error in them? And secondly, whether or not future improvements in those technologies, what they might do to these particular amendments. Should we, in other words, are these programs actually helping or harming?
Yeah, this is something I thought a little bit about, because this is the so to your first question about clearly the theoretical answer I would expect should be yes. We should not be seeing as many LOMAs, at least, occurring in places that have more precise measurements from LIDAR, say, versus the older, photogrammetry type of derived NED products. I didn't have a way, that was the question I had, and I obviously didn't really have a way, at least not within the span of this project, to do that, to look at that kind of thing. But given you mentioned a couple states, I mean, that could be a thing of study. You know, I would say if it has made a difference in my quick, you know, qualitative remembrance of some of the data, like I wouldn't say it's made a massive difference, because I don't feel like I remember seeing way less, you know, compared to what I would have maybe like expected for the size and number of people in the state of North Carolina or Oregon. So if now the back part of that story too, though, is especially, you know, some places like more probably Oregon than North Carolina, like those maps may be old enough that they still are using older products and still haven't been updated yet. So there's that whole mess too. But I think, so I think that was answered. So remind me, sorry, I'm blanking a little bit on the second part of your question.
I guess the question is more conceptual, which is, are these programs, do you think they might be
harming or
harming or helping in terms of inequalities
Harming or
or income or disparities in access?
I mean, in a conceptual way, they should be helping, because, you know, by the very, if you want to think of it in a very near definition kind of way, like the idea that these firms move towards is basically the more precise we can be, the better, right? Like if we could map everything super precisely, you know, down to a very, you know, minuscule accuracy, like that's what, you know, these engineers and hydrologists who are, you know, who are producing the maps seem to want, right? You know, is to like, and so it, you know, in that kind of theoretical way, like you would reach a point where there really shouldn't be any more, at least LOMAs, because we've dealt with all of the inaccuracies of the data, and only if a property then could be elevated, it would be, say, above the so in that kind of way, it deals with that kind of inequality or disparity, if you want to think of it, but it doesn't in any sort of way necessarily jump over to then who might or might not still seek a LOMA, you know, a letter map revision based on fill, and who could actually obtain one, who could pay the thousands of dollars or more to do it, and that kind of side of things. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yep, thanks. So I'm going to ask the committee now, if anybody has any last questions. I would like to give the audience a chance to ask some questions, but I want to ask the committee if there's any last bits in this public part. Okay, at this point, I'd like at least for Devin to have at least a few minutes where the audience can ask questions for Devin, and I'll try to moderate, but you can just speak out or raise your hand and I'll do my best, but there's a lot of you.